last time when I went live, I was like a minute late, and someone posted up on their story. They were like, "You're a minute late." So not again, not a minute late again.
You gotta be on time.
Anyway, so we're live now, and we're just waiting a little bit. So say hi in the comments. If you can't hear anything, let me know so I can fix it. But we'll be getting started in probably a couple minutes from now.
Wait.
So this video will be available at the end for anyone who wants to watch it again afterwards. But we'll just get started, and there might be some other people that come in while we are already rolling, but we'll just keep running with it. The subject of today's clinic is, partly exam stress and partly time management. And the poll that I ran on Instagram and Facebook, we had quite a lot of people voting, and it was like, I think exactly 50-50 split. I think we had, few dozen people say like for exam stress, and a few dozen exactly say for thing across Facebook and Instagram. So if you have any questions on any of the stuff that we are talking about in the comments, just write it up, and I'll either answer it afterwards or I'll see it while we're going. I'm viewing all the comments. So if you have any questions, just chuck them up on there and I'll get to it and answer it. There's probably going to be, especially when it comes to topics of stress and time management, it's pretty individualized, and there's a lot of variation for different situations and circumstances and people. So, like Vanessa and Jonathan, you guys are going to be able to ask me those questions and kind of refine that sort of thing. But, for anyone that's watching, it's not going to be possible for me to talk about every possible situation. So I'm going to do my best to cover all the cases, at least the common ones. But, it's up to you to really ask me on specific situations that I can give you advice on. So we'll start with, I guess, the exam stress and kind of dealing with the exams part. Now, Vanessa, was that actually a suggestion that you had? Was that yours?
Yeah, that was my one that I sent to you after your live for Girlbus Edge Healthcare.
So can you just kind of roughly explain like what the issue is and what the what your take and perspective on it is?
Right. So, moving here from South Africa 4 years ago, we didn't really do exams in year 9 and 10, but it started again in years 11 and 12 for NCA and that. So basically in South Africa, exams are like a major thing. So they're worth about 70% of your like whole year's grade. So I feel like there was a lot of stress put on achieving really well in those, because if you didn't, then you didn't do well for the year. So when I came here, I was fine for year 9 and I was fine for year 10. Like I didn't enjoy tests, but I kind of like dealt with them. And then we got to year 11 and like exams started and all of that. And I feel like it wasn't that I wasn't prepared for the exams. I just had this stress probably built up from South Africa, and that with them having so much importance, and that it got to the stage where I was probably impacting my grades by stressing so much. Like I knew what I was doing, but I was stressing so much about them that I was causing myself, like, I get this thing called like heat rashes when I get really nervous. I get really hot and they like spread everywhere. My friends always make fun of me. And I get really stressed to the point where I actually freak myself out, and I get like total mind blocks. Like I sit there in front of my exam and I cannot do anything because I can't think of anything.
You kind of get tunneled in.
Yeah, pretty much. And it's so weird because I always say to my friends, it's not like I haven't studied. Like I've studied, I know my content, and before I come into the exam, I can do past exams fine. But as soon as I get into the room for the exam, it's like this wall like builds up and I'm stuck.
So I think that's a interesting situation, because what you're talking about right now is actually there's a pre sort of programmed response to an exam environment that you're finding, right? And I think a lot of people have that type of issue. Like, I certainly see it a lot. So it's not uncommon at all. And a lot of people don't really, talk about it much, but I've seen it plenty of times. And the story is often pretty similar, high stakes exam. I get it a lot with people that have immigrated from other countries after they've done some schooling in other countries where exams, because New Zealand, the exams are not really such a big deal, but in other countries they can be, really, especially in Asia, like, high school exams, they can like dictate what university you go to and, your sort of career path to an extent. So there is a lot of kind of pressure around it. Are you aware of this thing called classical conditioning?
No.
Jonathan, have you heard of that?
I've heard of it, but I'm not sure what that is.
Oh, we've got Carmen here. We'll just bring her in. Hey, Carmen.
Hi.
Hey, we're live on YouTube already, so we were just talking about how with exam stress. Vanessa was talking about how when she enters into an exam, she gets like kind of stressed and tunneled in because of the exam, and it seems really like there's just been so much to do with exams, and it's so hyped up, and you're just sort of psyching yourself out, and that's kind of the situation. So classical conditioning, have you heard of that, Carmen?
No, never.
So classical conditioning is otherwise known as Pavlovian conditioning. You might have heard that.
Yeah.
Have you guys heard of that before? Pavlovian conditioning? So Pavlovian conditioning was based off the scientist called Pavlov, and Pavlov had these dogs. And the original experiment went something like he had these dogs and he used to feed these dogs, but before he fed them, he'd ring this bell. So that he rings the bell, the dogs come, he feeds them. Over time, what happens is that when he rings the bell, the dogs will salivate, even without food. And so classical conditioning, otherwise known as Pavlovian conditioning, is the phenomenon where if you have a certain stimulus and a certain effect or an emotion, then they can become joined. They can become fused together. Now, there's two really important things to note about classical conditioning. Is number one is that the experiment was done in dogs, and it occurs in humans. What that means is that it's a reasonably primitive sort of thing, right? It's not going to be dependent on our rational thought. And this is why rational thinking about it often doesn't change it, because it's not, there are certain things that the more forebrain part of our thinking can help with. This is not one of those things. So classical conditioning is sort of unavoidable. It's hardwired deep into our brain. The other thing is that we can actually exploit this and use it to our advantage. So if we want something to happen, we can classically condition ourselves to make that happen. And by classically conditioning ourselves enough times, it becomes almost a habit that's impossible to break, because it's so hard, it takes so much effort to override that conditioning. So a lot of athletes will have classical conditioned patterns with certain things. So do you guys play sports? Yeah. Any sports? So if you think about a sport, if you play tennis, Jonathan, do you not play in a sport?
I'm like, yes, well, no.
If you imagine, like, if you play tennis, there's a serve, you throw it in the air. There's, people will have that. If you've ever seen a game, they have a specific way they bounce it. They bounce it twice, so they bounce it 3 times at a certain distance from the ground, and they throw it a certain way. Or, badminton or soccer, or like before a penalty shot. There's a specific routine that they go through before, and that routine, sometimes it's called a ritual, is a form of classical conditioning where they've trained that particular pattern enough times to produce a certain response. And by doing that pattern, which is a conscious decision, they can involuntarily invoke a certain response. So obviously this happens for negative things as well. For example, addiction. And Vanessa, in your case, what's probably happening is that you've had this psyched up emotion associated with exams that's being conditioned in with the act of taking the exam. And so that comes as a bundle. Because it's a conditioned thing, it becomes a little bit harder to deal with than other types of exam stress. And it takes a while, and there's a gradual series of steps to do it. So anyone who's watching and feels that they resonate with this particular type of thing. It doesn't have to be exams either. It can be anything, anything that there's this particular bundled anxiety or emotion that comes with it. It's the same thing that's going to apply. The first thing is that we acknowledge that that thought and the emotion are actually fused together, right? Sometimes we can call this that the thought and the action is fused together, right? So the action occurs and the thought comes with it. So this is actually called thought-action fusion, is the actual term for this. Thought-action fusion refers to the fact that there is that psychological coupling where the action shouldn't necessarily, the physical thing shouldn't necessarily provoke the response, yet it does. So the best example of this is anxiety. Anxiety is an alarm response of your body in response to perceived danger. It's the exact same type of response you would get when you have a high level of adrenaline and you're really excited, right? Heart racing faster, sweaty, clammy hands. Your breathing gets, your airways dilate, and there's lots of different changes that occur, and it's just your fight or flight response taking action. And that's because there's a thought-action fusion along, with it. What you're perceiving with anxiety is that your brain thinks there's a danger which doesn't actually exist. But what you are noticing is not the perceived danger. What you're noticing is your body's response to it. So you're noticing that your heart's racing. You're noticing that your hands are shaking and your hands are getting clammy, and you're noticing that. And because you notice that, that is triggering the emotional response that's negative associated with it. So that same exact physical response, if it was in the contents of like a competition or some kind of sports event, you might not have a negative emotion associated with it. So there's actually two separate things that are occurring. There's a physical aspect of what's occurring, and then there's the involuntary emotional or mental response that comes in after the fact. So this is really important because we can actually break that. It's possible to defuse. So it's called thought-action diffusion. And there's a series of steps that you can go through to break away from that. So this is one of the things that's part of the acceptance commitment therapy, I think, ACT, which is one of the cognitive behavioral therapies that's used to overcome anxiety. And I think it's a 4-step process, and it's pretty funny. The first one is that you give your brain a silly name, like banana or something. Or like you can call it like banana bean. So you the first step is that you greet it. You greet your brain. You say like, "Hi, banana bean." That's the first step. And so the reason you do that is because the silliness out of it helps you break out of the spiral and the tunnel before it sinks you in too deeply. And it's an important part, which is recognizing the source of the problem, which is your brain's response. So that's the first step. So, hi there, banana bean. And then the second part is that you acknowledge the response that's occurring. You say, I can see that you think I'm in danger and you're making me, go into this fight or flight response. That's the second step. And the third step is thanking your brain for that response. Thanks for looking out for me and doing that. And the fourth step is, but it's not actually necessary. So you're consciously step-by-step defusing it and systematically looking at the danger response and trying to allow the more conscious, rational part of your brain to take over, as opposed to what would normally happen, which is a very emotionally driven part of your brain spiraling you through. By doing this 4-step system, it acts to, at the top, before you kind of go down that cliff and you're just diving in, aims to break you out of that and activate more of the rational part of your brain to break you out of that. So this is a technique that I've used many times in my life. Way back when I was really bad at public speaking and I was afraid of public speaking, I used to use this all the time. Before my medical interviews, I did this technique. Like, it's just a 4-step cognitive process, and you sort of feel it starting to calm down a little bit. So that's one thing, thought action diffusion and breaking that. The second aspect is the yellow Jeep effect. The yellow Jeep effect says that when I say don't think of a yellow Jeep, you will think of a yellow Jeep. So for whatever reason, our brains are hardwired to think about something that we shouldn't think about when we're instructed against it than any other stimulus. So when you do studies on people that, involving like a yellow Jeep, the people that think of it the most are not the people that are instructed to think of it. They're not the people that heard the word yellow Jeep the most times. It's just the person that was told, don't think about the yellow Jeep. And again, this is like a really primitive thing as well. So it's really hard to overcome it. For example, when you have a child who was brought up in a very abusive household and all they observe is the abusive parents, what they're thinking is, I'm not going to become like that. I'm not going to become a person that's like that. And so because they're so focused on what they're not trying to be, their brain assigns it a high level of importance and it learns about that really, really well. And it becomes the easiest thing to be because you're so focused on it, which is why children that are brought up in abusive households are more likely to become abusive parents themselves, despite not wanting to. And in fact, because of not wanting to. And so this is part of the yellow Jeep effect. So it's hard to not think of something by trying not to think of something. So what we do is we think of something instead. So if we look at the abusive, family example, it's like, think of what you want instead. Don't say, I don't want to be like an abusive parent. Think, I want to be a loving parent and have a supportive family. So you focus on that. So same thing with these things that might give you stress is not about, don't think, I don't want to feel anxious. I don't want to feel like this. Don't try to stop the feelings from happening. Do the 4-step system to acknowledge it and turn your brain off on that, and then focus on what you want. So focus on, I want to feel open. I want to feel I want to feel relaxed. I want to feel like all the individual things that you're aiming towards. And then that reorientates your brain. So once it's broken out of the cycle, it can actually go towards where it needs to go. Vanessa, what you were talking about with that, whole mental block, it's probably, that means that it should have been applied a little bit earlier before that. Yeah. So when you let it go for too long, it gets harder and harder to break out of that. So it's important that when as soon as you feel it, it's like, okay, wait, banana bean mate, you got to just chill out. And then you use that system and then you focus on, okay, where am I needing to go? Okay, I need to be open-minded. I need to be, breathing easy. I need to be relaxed, and I need to be thinking laterally and creatively. So you take deep breaths and things like that. Because of the fact that this type of situation is so difficult to deal with, I'm giving you lots of different techniques to use because you might have to use all of these. So deep breathing, which I've just kind of really quickly mentioned, is another thing that you should be using. So there's this nerve that goes from your brain stem, actually, and it goes to your diaphragm. It's called the vagus nerve, cranial nerve, that is involved with this thing called the parasympathetic nervous response. And parasympathetic is basically the opposite of the fight or flight response. It's the rest and digest response. And it goes straight to your diaphragm. So when you breathe in really deeply, actually what happens is that it's quite a complicated series of sort of physiological feedback loops. But what pretty much ends up happening is that when you breathe in, your sympathetic, your fight or flight response increases by a little bit. And when you breathe out, it actually does the opposite. It turns that off and your rest and digest response increases by a little bit. You can actually feel this. So if you just measure your heart rate and just take an idea of what your pulse rate is, and you breathe in, while you're breathing in, you will feel that your heart rate increases. And then if you breathe out slowly, you will feel that your heart rate slows down. Okay, if you're really in tune with that, when you're going to sleep, sometimes you can hear your heartbeat, right? So if you focus on having a breathe in, that's reasonably short, maybe 2 seconds deep breathe in through the diaphragm to stretch your diaphragm out as much as possible. And then you think about breathing out really slowly. So breathe in for like 2 seconds, hold it for 2 seconds just to let everything stabilize, and then breathe out for like 4 seconds. What you're doing now is you're spending more time in the rest and digest parasympathetic response and less time in the fight or flight sympathetic response. And it physiologically forces you to calm down more. This is why deep breathing works. So, so as a quick recap, so there's that 4-step system for acceptance, commitment, therapy, ACT, on how to target your anxiety at the very beginning, and then focusing on what you're aiming for and what you want. And then the next step was the slow kind of deep breathing. And then over time, you will break out of that classical conditioning over time. The final part of that kind of puzzle, which would make it better, is graduated exposure. Graduated exposure means that if you're afraid of spiders, don't wake someone out with a spider on their face. Get them to look at a picture of a spider, at a distance. Get them to look at it up close. Get them to touch a photo of a spider. Get them to be in the vicinity of a spider inside a box. Get them to look at the spider with the box open. Get them to put the hand next to the spider or something, It's graduated exposure. So anything that you have this type of response to, you can do that for. So with this, particular exam example, I know there are a lot of people that have a fear response when it comes to exams. Some of the things that you can do is if you know where you're going to be sitting the exam, see if you can just sit in that room and then imagine you're sitting the exam and just get used to the smell and the sound and the kind of vibe. The other thing is when you're studying at home, try to imagine you're in an exam environment and then study. So you put yourself in situations where it's increasingly closer and closer to an exam. And if exam environments truly, really trigger this, visceral response, you may even want to get a group of friends together to do a practice, like mock exam for yourself, just to get even more and more used to that. And that also gives you more opportunities to apply these other steps that I talked about, which gives you more repetitions and more practice, right? So that's kind of the system to break out of it. Does that sort of make sense?
No, it makes sense.
Yeah. Did you guys have any questions?
No.
So if I got one. So from the first step, the first, second, and third step doesn't work. Like if I'm still very anxious after the third step, do I repeat? Like go back to 1 and start again?
So when you say first step, you're talking about that like acknowledgement of the brain, that sort of thing. So there's something I actually kind of didn't really mention as much. When you are in the second step, right? When you're focusing on what you're wanting and then you're doing the deep breaths, right? That's in a way a form of mindfulness meditation. And what you're wanting to do is focus in very closely on either the sensation of breathing or whatever it is that you're focusing on. You want to stay there. You want to just stay there because when you're in that point, it's not going to get worse. And it's going to give you the opportunity to just sit and chill for a bit and kind of get used to the situation. And you stay there for as long as you need to. And then you can break out of it and see if that response comes back. And if you feel it coming back, you just start again and you just stay there. And you just stay there. So you just let your body kind of almost acclimate in a way to the, environment of stress. And that's really the case with mindfulness in general, is that mindfulness may not solve the problem, but it stops it at least from getting worse. And you just stay there until it's dealt with and it goes away. And then when you break out of that, then you see if you're still affected by it. And if you are, you just slip back into it until the problem goes away. Right? So that's a form of exam stress. I guess another form of exam stress is the preparation leading up to the exams, which Vanessa, it sounds like you didn't really have a big issue with, right?
No, I think when I'm preparing and like either doing tests at school where we're like in a normal class environment and doing like a mock exam or stuff like that, like I'm fine and I have no block or anything. But as soon as I know it's like the real deal, like this actually starts counting for grades, it's suddenly like, as I said, this wall builds up and stuff like that.
Yeah. So in that case, the graduated exposure thing is probably going to be less important, and it's going to be more so just that kind of mentality and just breaking out of that conditioning, and a lot of that mindfulness related stuff is going to go a long way. I'll just talk about some of the exam preparation related stuff, because people will stress out about exam preparation all the time. This is actually a lot easier to deal with, because if you have a good exam study schedule and study system, then, well, objectively speaking, you should be reasonably safe. And if you have a disproportionate stress response to the exam prep, even though your schedule and everything is fine, then what that means is that the problem is actually no longer that the preparation is stressing you out. The problem is actually the fact that the student is unable to deal with the stress. That's actually a really important distinction, and it takes me a while for this to be communicated through to some of my students, is that if you're preparing for an exam and you're stressed, but objectively speaking, your revision technique and your study schedule is good, the problem is not the exam prep. The problem is the fact that they're not able to deal with the stress. And probably that's going to be something that's totally transferable and affects them in other areas of stress as well. Now, the solution it sounds really similar, because it involves doing a lot of scheduled, regular mindfulness meditation, as well as simple things like journaling and things that slow down the thoughts and make them more clear and explicit, and identifying what the problem is. So a lot of the students that I work with that come to me in kind of emergency save my life mode, where they're just before their exams and they're stressed to all hell, sometimes just the idea of saying, okay, stop and just list for me what the problems are and what your responses and how your feelings are about them, sometimes that alone is actually enough just to bring them all the way down. And it's such a simple thing that people are not really used to doing. And really, especially for guys, actually, I find that a big reason that they don't is, and actually just like a lot of young people in general, there is a sort of preconception, a misconception that to get better at something, it should be natural. It should feel right. It should be like, it sort of naturally solves itself. But that's actually not the case, Like, we live in a society where the stresses that we are exposed to are completely evolutionarily we're not adapted for at all. They're so supranormal, and it's entirely all humanly constructed. So we are really under-equipped from a natural point of view just to deal with everything, right? That's why there are so many adverse things that occur as a result of increased exposure to things that are very humanly constructed, right? So there is a relationship between social media consumption and mental health. That's a thing, right? We're not naturally evolved to just deal with that. But the thing is social media going to reduce? No, it's probably just going to increase, right? So the thing is that because we're dealing with an artificial environment that we live in, and unless you're going to go live as a hermit in the mountains, eating herbs, the only possible way to overcome it is with an artificial strategy. And those never really feel natural when you first start using them. So there's a lot of resistance that people find from doing things like journaling or meditation because it feels fake. That's the point. That's the point, is that if you're in a gunfight already and you're like, oh no, my fists have naturally evolved to be better at this. It's like, well, that's why you're going to die. Right? So I think that's kind of a perspective. And I know for a fact that someone watching this video is going to resonate with this damn story. The idea that there's so many things like we know we should do. And some of the time, not all the time, some of the time, the thing that puts us back from actually doing those things It's just this feeling that it just feels so fake or artificial or like unnatural to put it in there and to enforce it on ourselves. Especially, I think, for students that are sort of in university, they're getting away from the idea of like everything being structured for them. They're gaining a bit more independence back. And then it's like, oh no, you need to be now in charge of like putting all this random structure in your life. It feels like you're almost going backwards, but actually it's not. It's about taking ownership of that. So the solution ends up being, in a way, really simple and in a way really difficult, because if the thing that's bothering you is stress, what has to happen is all the basics need to be there. You need to have good peer support. You need to be eating healthy. You need to have, don't engage in criminal activity. You need to have good physical exercise. And you need to have adequate and optimum sleep. You need to have a certain amount of sunlight. And by the way, anyone listening, make a checklist of those things. Because literally, when I feel really stressed, I just go through this checklist. Like, am I getting enough sleep, exercise, food, social interaction? Sunlight is actually surprisingly a big one. It doesn't help that my basement is a freaking my office is in the basement, yeah, Jonathan knows.
Yeah.
I get like 1 hour of sunlight in here per day. And then on top of that are the additional things: structure, time management, which we're just about to talk about, and mindfulness meditation, journaling, and good prioritization. When you have all of those things in place and you're tracking them and you're taking care of them, you're taking ownership of it, it takes a lot to derail a person. I just had a comment here on YouTube. It says, how do you recover after burnout with regards to productivity? Well, that's the thing. That's why it's called burnout. You got to wait. You just wait it out. Because the thing is, when you're burnt out, when you're really burnt out, there's nothing left, You just don't care. The whole like, you don't give a shit about anything. You don't even, it's like, a shit is not given even remotely close to your location. Like, that's the idea of burnout, is that you're completely down to nothing. And I've been burnt out a couple times, and it takes a long time to recover. When you're burnt out, same thing. Just make sure you've got the right routines in terms of time management, and within that time managed routine, you're ticking off diet, exercise, social interaction, sunlight, all the other stuff that I said. And when all of that is in place, that allows you to slowly recover long enough. But the best thing is that you try to avoid getting into that position in the first place, which is what I'll be talking about soon as well with effective time management strategies. One more question we had is, would you say that in the middle of a stressful moment, you just need to find that ease in mind? Yeah. So in the middle of the peak of a stressful moment, the idea is just break it and just find a little bit of mental peace and tranquility using mindfulness meditation, and just stay in there until everything else kind of subsides. Most of the problems, we're creating them for ourselves. It's not inherently in the environment. Like when you're sitting there in an exam, or when you're sitting there about to do whatever thing that you're really anxious about, there isn't really anything inherently wrong with that moment, unless, for example, you're being held hostage and like you're being tortured, in which case, yes, there is something wrong at that moment. But most of the time, that's not the case. And if you really focus in on just that moment, usually you can find some kind of reprieve while your brain sort of settles down and you go through those steps and cycles. Any questions about any of that stuff?
It all makes sense. Like,
Yeah, it
hear
makes
it.
logical sense.
Yeah. It's easy to do as well. It is easy to do in a way. The difficult part of doing it is actually just being consistent and getting through it in the first place, right? Which is a great segue to time management. Sustainable time management that works, okay? And like, I really cannot stress how important this is. I have spent a lot of time looking at different time management frameworks and experimenting things. A lot. Any time management system that you've ever heard of, I promise you, I've tried it. And a lot of the time, the issue with these not that they don't work, but time management itself is actually a really, it ends up being a really superficial goal. That's not usually where the problem is. And so what we want is, we need to be really specific. What we want is we want to be able to work when we need to work, break when we need to break, And overall, that system of working when we need to work, breaking when we need to break, needs to make us feel happy and energized and something that we can do forever and ever. When we work, we want to be focused. When we break, we want to be relaxed. That's what we actually want. That is packaged as time management. And that's something that it took me years to really wrap my head around, is that we don't manage time. We don't manage time. I don't like compress time and the world around me slows. It doesn't work that way. We don't even have a sense of time. We don't even measure time. How long has this live stream been going on for? Do you guys know?
I've been here for 30 minutes, I think.
Yeah, I don't even know. But the idea is that we have a really bad sense of time. What we do have a sense of is activity. We have a sense of our energy and our focus and the activities that we're doing, which is why if all you do is sleep all day, you don't know. When you wake up in the middle of the night, you don't know what time it is. So when we say time management, there's nothing about time that we're managing. We're not even managing our journey through time, because time flowing means effectively nothing in our lives other than the fact that eventually we die. The only thing that we're managing is the stack of activities that we have next to each other. So what we are managing is not time. And there's no point trying to manage time and schedule things in a particular way if we don't do this first. And what that is we need to manage our attention. And so that's why I preach to all of my students attention management rather than time management. So attention management means that at any point, you are very aware of where your attention and focus and energy is, and is that aligned with where you want it to be? So when you wake up in the morning, time management would say, what time do you wake up? What time will you work? When will you take your break? Attention management says, when you gain consciousness, where is your attention and where do you want that to be? And now this opens up an entirely different way of thinking. Because actually, as long as we have priorities and overall parameters around what time we want to achieve something, it doesn't really matter anymore what time things happen. And this is why a lot of time management systems break, is because they're really fragile and rigid. I don't know if have you experimented much with different time management frameworks or strategies?
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but for me, I found that it's really hard to be super consistent every single day for a long time. And I often find that I'm switching time management strategies. Well, I find one that works, and then when I enter into a different part of my life, it just breaks. So if I go on a holiday, it just breaks. That's my personal experience. So with attention management, that becomes impossible. Because what you do is you just set a priority, a few priorities for the day. And then you think, when is the optimal time from an attention point of view that I'll have the highest likelihood of accomplishing that priority? So if it's, for example, my priority, 3 priorities for the day, study a certain amount, go do some exercise, and do all my life admin that I've been neglecting for a month, then you think, okay, at what time of the day am I going to be most likely to achieve these? Okay, going to exercise, morning. Okay, so in the morning I'll exercise. When am I likely to do the study? In the afternoon? Okay, I'll do that in the afternoon. When am I likely to do life admin? Evening. So I just block it up into these huge blocks of time. And then in terms of what I'm actually doing on a minutely or hourly basis, I leave that entirely to attention management to micromanage. So it's like, okay, in the morning, I need to get this done. So I wake up, where's my attention? Well, if my attention is nowhere, and I want it to be nowhere, that's all good. If my attention is nowhere, but I want it to be on doing a mental recap of what I studied yesterday, so I'm priming myself for the day, then that means I now have control of that time, which I probably wouldn't have had access to before. And I can start rearranging my environment to allow my attention to be activated in that time. So I wake up, I'm going to put some flashcards, stick them to the mirror in my bathroom. So while I'm brushing my teeth, I can mentally recap a few key concepts. I can switch that around every single night. So now I've optimized my environment around where my attention is most likely to be, not wrapping my entire freaking essence and being around a random as 24-hour set of time, which is based on pretty much nothing other than like societal expectation for when you should do something, right? So when you think about it that way, time management makes very little sense when our environment is so malleable around us. if you have to go to school or class, where is your attention? Do you want it to be in class? If you do, then what can you do in your environment or your technique to increase your attention and focus for whatever that activity is? When you're taking your break, where is your attention? Do you want to be taking a break where you're still thinking about studying and going through concepts? Because then you'll take a different type of break. Do you want to take a break where you're just relaxing? Because then you'll take a different type of break there. So attention management is effective for every day because you're constantly in tune to where your attention and focus is if you calibrate that. If you are having a shitty day and your attention is waning really quickly and you notice that your focus is going down, you got to think, okay, what can I do to change that focus? Can I change this up? Instead of sitting here at my desk, what can I do to increase my attention? Think of what you can do to increase your attention. Wrap the study and the technique and the environment around that. Sitting here, pretty hot, no wind through the window, falling asleep studying, what can I do? Going for a walk would bring my attention up. How can I make that walk productive? I'm going to take 3 sets of notes with me and I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to read through them and quiz myself as I walk and then go for a stroll for 20 minutes. We're getting effective learning done, or whatever the productive part of what we wanted to achieve was. And we're constantly throughout the day thinking, how can I maximize my attention? Attention is falling because I'm super tired now. Take a rest, because that's what the attention needs to do. You feel that you're ready to start again? You start again. So things like Pomodoro technique, 5217, things that have these fixed work and rest timers, they're good when you're just a beginner, just getting the idea of having timed work and things. But when you really want to have something sustainable that you can use every day in and out, this is a lot more effective because you just work until you feel like, hey, my focus is waning a little bit. All right, I'm going to take a break. How long do I need to take a break for? Just going to keep an eye on how long it takes for me to regain attention. And that ends up usually being about 1/3 of the time you were working for. So you'll do that, and then maybe 15, 20 minutes later, you think, hey, my attention is pretty good now. I'm feeling pretty sharp. You get back into it. 35 minutes later, you take another break for 7.5 minutes, and then you study for another 14.4 minutes, and then you take a break for 75 seconds. And so, it means that you're constantly optimized for your specific need at that point. And therefore, because you are keeping yourself as optimum as possible, your output is optimum all the time. So with time management, the purpose was to get more stuff done. But it doesn't actually allow that. This actually allows you to get more stuff done because you're actually making decisions based on what allows you to be the most optimum productive version of yourself at any given moment. So this is a time management technique that I use. I have clear priorities on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis that I constantly track through, and I review them almost every single day. I set those priorities to specific time blocks. Usually those time blocks are 2 to 3 hours in size. So I have maybe 4 or 5 different blocks throughout the day. And I always leave enough gaps and buffer so that I can, screw it up and just have fun or whatever it is throughout the day. It's just highly flexible. And then I just attention manage throughout the day. I'll just go from activity to activity to activity, and it allows me to enter into a flow state, and I stay into a flow state, and I'll stay into a flow state for hours and hours. I'll get everything done. And if I feel like my plan that I'd set up in my time block was not right because I'm too damn tired to move on to the next thing, that's fine. I'll push it back because I've got that buffer space that I already pre-programmed in. So that's pretty much the extent of time management that I think is effective. And there are so many other things that you can do to increase your time management from a granular control point of view. I just don't think for most people it's effective. Maybe if you're like Elon Musk and you have to save the world single-handedly, yeah, maybe you need to manage your time a lot more. But for most people, and I would consider myself an above average level of busy, it's completely sustainable and highly productive to just be able to do this day in, day out. And this is another reason why I only take 1 or 2 days off per month. It's because I just don't feel the need to as much because I'm really staying optimum as much as possible. Right? So this is something that I really had to learn when I was, working as a doctor as well as running my business, because I was clocking in, no less than 80 hours a week, any given week. I'll do 80 to 100 hours a week, and I'll do work every single weekend. And I did that for years. And the only way to make that sustainable is take the break whenever you need to, even if I'm at work. where's my attention, your attention might not have to be anywhere at that time. You might be doing something, like, I don't know, like mowing the lawn or something. That could be your break, because your attention doesn't need to be there. Where do you want your attention to be? I want to be relaxing. So you just wrap your head around that and do that. So I'd be at work relaxing, or I'd be working on a walk. Like, so, when you sort of think about the fact that you are actually actively in control of not only your external, but your internal environment, it opens up a lot of possibilities about how to do things. So one of the questions that I get asked probably on a daily basis is someone who's like, I'm struggling to fit in mindfulness, so I'm struggling to fit in whatever, I'm struggling to fit in, something. It's not that you're struggling to fit it in. You're struggling because you're trying to fit it in. And if you're trying to fit it in, you need to make space. But the reason that you're trying to do this is because you didn't have space in the first place. So it's kind of a self-defeating argument. The only way that you get more, out of life and you just do more and manage your time better is not by making more space. It's by finding the space that you're not actually using and using it more intentionally. So many people are out there saying, hey, I don't have time in my day for mindfulness meditation or whatever. And it's like, okay, do you bus, train, walk, wait for anything ever? If the answer is yes, you have time. If you're in a traffic jam, what are you doing? Are you going to get out of the car or like jump out of the bus and like run to wherever you need to be? You're probably just going to be sitting there, and there's probably nothing else that you can do during that time except either bitch and moan or use that time effectively. Right? So there are a lot of these little micro opportunities that don't get utilized. And again, there's a mentality around like, well, I don't want to be using my time so actively and being so in control, because it feels so artificial. And it's like, look, you don't have to. It's really your choice and it's your option. I think I said this in the girl boss thing as well, right? It's that like, if you have a certain amount of things on your plate, you either get a bigger plate or you start dropping things. Mm. Someone even quoted me on that and actually made a post on it.
Yeah.
But that's really the thing, is that, this whole idea of time management and efficiency, all of it, it's not that it's for everyone and everyone has to do it. It's like, this is a legitimate solution to solve a problem. If you don't have the problem, it's fine. But if you want more and you don't want to sacrifice more, there's only one possible way forward, and it's just to do these things. And even if it feels unnatural, well, you know what? Give it enough time, it becomes a habit. It's natural now. So, a couple different sort of perspectives on the time management sort of thing. It's a really different way of thinking about time management that I don't see pushed very often. But like, honestly, this works for me very well. And, this is something I can feel I can use every single day of my life. And it's very little effort and it feels very flexible. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Any questions about that process? It is a pretty different way of thinking about kind of conventional time management.
My question would be, I'm a person who is on the socials a lot. I'm a very social person, and it is really, really difficult to get out of the, wee dopamine hits while you're scrolling. And I'm very aware that I need to be doing something else, but I just can't, I actually I'm sitting there, I'm like, Carmen, get off your phone. But like, do you have any, advice for pulling yourself out of that?
3 things. First one is that, do you really need to be doing something else?
Probably.
Yeah.
Because
I feel what you're asking, Carmen.
Yeah.
So here's my approach for a lot of things. And this is very different from what a lot of people recommend and what a lot of people do. Mm-hmm. But again, this works for me. Now, here's one that I wouldn't always recommend to everyone, but I would recommend maybe just think about it and see if it might work for you. I operate in a state of constant urgency. So I actually deliberately do not do things until they become urgent, where there's no other option for me to. And the other thing is that I just have a lot of things I do. So I've got something urgent every day. So from my point of view, I'm living on a daily deadline, which might seem stressful, but hey, controlling the stress is just a skill. And it's a choice that I'm making. So there's this thing called Parkinson's law. And Parkinson's law says an activity will fill the time allocated for it. So if you've got an essay that's due in 2 weeks, versus in 2 days. And the quality of the essay is probably going to be pretty similar. And if you know that it's only going to take you 3 hours to smash it out, you're probably going to do it the night before anyway. And it's probably going to be fine. So here's the thing is that, like, if you've been like living a life of kind of cramming stuff in and it's actually worked out okay, then maybe that means that you can cram a lot more than you might think. There are certain things you shouldn't, and that's something that you need to be importantly sort of thinking about when you're prioritizing. And you think, you know, if there's something that you should be thinking about later, that takes a long period of time to think about it, then you might want to break that bigger goal down into daily goals to get a sense of urgency and see exactly what the milestones are. But when I do that, I make sure to track it all the way down through to the latest possible. So I don't set due dates for something that's like, okay, if I've got an essay, let's say I'm writing a thesis, okay? A thesis takes a long ass time to write, seriously. So my thesis, non-stop writing, is like a month of just straight write every day, 12 hours a day of writing. It took like a month to write that because time to review it. But in your head, you sort of think, well, how long could it take to write? So if you break it down into all the mini steps, it's like, okay, at the latest possible, I need to have it reviewed a week before. At the latest possible, in order for it to be reviewed the week before, I need to finish it 2 days before that. At the latest possible, so I set these latest possible goals, which makes me think, holy shit, I'm already 3 days behind. For my latest possible deadlines, like best case scenario deadlines, and then that develops that sense of urgency. So that's just a thought, is that sometimes when you're lazy or you're feeling like you're kind of procrastinating or whatever, it's not always a bad thing. It just means that there isn't a sense of urgency or priority, but maybe there doesn't need to be. So that's just something to work around, because that can be a really big time suck. Because you might have a certain amount of things that you do, and you're thinking, I don't have time to do all of these things because I'm barely getting it done right now. Maybe it's because you're giving yourself too much time to do it. Maybe if you just did more stuff, you would just fit more in that time. So for me, like, I'm constantly living in urgency, I'm constantly cramming, but I'm constantly keeping myself optimum, so I'm able to do a lot more as a result. I think I'll be a lot less productive if I did less things, if I had less things on my plate, right? Like, you don't get good at juggling by holding one ball, right? So I'm gonna put that on Instagram one day. Just click that into my mind there. Save it for the bank.
That's a good one.
So that's one thing, one aspect, and it's a part that I think a lot of people overlook, and it goes against conventional wisdom in a lot of ways, but it does actually work in some important ways as well. The other part is that there's a difference between doing something later and not doing something. We very rarely don't do something, except math. But we do often.
That's true.
But we do often think, I'm not going to do it, when we mean I'm going to do it later. And that's another important thing. Don't tell yourself I'm not going to do it. Tell yourself I'm going to do it later. What I'm kind of saying is, procrastinate, you're procrastinating. Right? And it really works. Like, for example, if I want to, smash out like 4 hours on YouTube. And, I'm not going to go into it thinking, I'm going to smash out 4 hours on YouTube when I have all this other stuff to do. It's going to be like I'm going to go and watch something on YouTube. And yes, there's lots of other little specific techniques there. But my general approach is like, all right, sweet, I'm going to do that. I'm just going to do that after this. Right? And in my mind, I'm like, okay, I'm going to do that later. And eventually, either it fades away, or I've gotten enough stuff done that I don't care and I can legitimately take that break. So that's another thing. Procrastinate, you're procrastinating. Have faith in your ability to procrastinate. Yeah. And the third thing is minimum viable goals. So I've got another YouTube video about minimum viable goals, but people, again, this is one of those things that comes up on a daily basis. I don't know if you've seen that video yet, but the idea is that don't create goals that are, you guys do chemistry, right? You guys are familiar with chemistry, right? You guys are familiar with activation energy.
Yeah.
right? So anyone that's watching that's not doing chemistry, basically for a reaction to occur, you go from a state of different levels of energy, and usually it's from a state of high energy to a state of lower energy at the end. And in order to do that, you go from high energy to low energy. It doesn't go like this. It goes like this. There's a bump. There's a little hurdle that needs to be overcome. Now you can put that exact same energy graph, that exact same bump and down on a graph of motivation. So in order to do something, you usually start at a period of motivation. I'm going to do something, but it's not enough. It doesn't get you there. There's, for some reason, this little additional hurdle that needs to be overcome in order to do that, right? And that hurdle is where procrastination comes in. It's that moment of hesitation where you really are thinking about what you need to do and why you need to do it and what it means and the opportunity cost and all of that sort of stuff. And again, it goes back to your priority, right? If I said, Carmen, look, you need to get off social media and you need to study. Otherwise, I'm going to go murder your whole family. Right? You're going to be like, okay, yeah, I'm going to study now. Yeah. You're like...
yeah. Mm-hmm. No, just kidding.
Yeah. So...
I'll go study.
So in a way, it's a matter of priority.
Yeah.
Right? If someone is, can't breathe, they don't care about anything other than air. Right? Air means everything to them. There's this I think it's like a Buddhist saying, it doesn't matter how like enlightened or whatever you are, when you need to pee, all you need to do is you need to pee. Everyone is the same. When they really need to pee, everyone is equalized.
That's true.
And it's kind of, similar sort of vein is that when you're procrastinating something, it's really kind of a priority decision that's being made there, saying that this is not a high enough priority. And so again, should it be in terms of the urgency? And if it should be, maybe you're procrastinating, or use a minimum viable goal, which basically acts as a catalyst. It prevents it from being a big activation energy hump that requires a lot of motivation, and it makes it so that it's the easiest possible thing to do. So if you imagine your motivation is going up and down constantly, right? That's natural. That's human. To create a goal that requires at least 50% motivation means that you are creating a goal that you know is not sustainable every time. Right? Unless you never get below 50% motivation. Me personally, I probably peak out at 50% motivation. So for me, I would never ever create a goal that requires more than the smallest amount of motivation. So you create a goal that is the minimum viable goal. Viable meaning gets you towards where you need to go. Right? So what can you do when you have no motivation? So lying in bed, this is the sort of thing that I teach. When I really need to getting out of bed, that's like the highest motivation thing for me. Everything else in the day is easy after that. Is, okay, instead of getting out of bed, why don't you just, open your eyes for a period of 5 seconds and then close them again. And then just do that. 5-second intervals. And then next thing, why don't I just wiggle my limbs around a little bit? And then maybe stick an arm out into that cold damn air and leave my arm out there. And then maybe shift my body to the edge of the bed. And then get up on my elbow. And then, so the thing is that each point, none of the goals seem particularly difficult to do. And you just continually work through that process. So if you need to study, don't study. If you want to go on Facebook, go on Facebook. Just go on Facebook later, but first sit at your desk. And then when you're at your desk, go on Facebook, but do it just after you've got your books out. And then do it just after you've picked up a pen. And then do it after you've studied for just 1 minute. And after 1 minute, you can just stop. Now, the important thing is that you give yourself the legitimate option of quitting at each point. If that legitimate option of quitting is not there, it's just a trick. And it's not a trick. It's real. You're saying, I'll sit at my desk, and at that time, I'll make a decision. I'll either go on Facebook later and just get my books out first, or I will go back on Facebook. And that's a legitimate option. And so that's really important. Same with going for a run. So sometimes I'll feel like shit and I don't want to go to the gym. I'll go to the gym and I'll I'll spend like 15 minutes there and I'll be like, okay, I'm actually just going to go home, and I'll go home. But the thing is, I did something at least. And most importantly, I'm slowly training the habit. If initially it was difficult for me to even get in my car and get to the gym, eventually that will be easy, and the difficult part will be for me to go from 15 minutes to 30 minutes. And eventually the difficult part will be to go from 30 to 1 hour. And the difficult part is getting a more intense workout, and the more difficult part is whatever. So it means that the habits start building, and the amount of goals you need starts sort of skipping some steps. You no longer need to even set a goal to go for a run. Going for a run is easy. That requires no effort. You do that without even thinking. It's going for 4 kilometers instead of 3. That's the thing. So you set your minimum viable goal. So if you live with minimum viable goal, like if you on the surface, I sound like an incredibly non-productive, unhealthy individual. I am in constant urgency, procrastinating pretty much everything, and never setting a goal that seems achievable if I need any amount of motivation. And that's basically the mantra through which I live my life. And it works, honestly, pretty damn well. Okay, I get some stuff done. And it's super sustainable, right? It feels really sustainable. And the really good thing is it actually blends in with that attention management really, really smoothly. And it becomes a super cohesive, easy system. There's nothing complicated to think about. All you need to do is just in the moment, where's your attention, okay, and just like minimum viable goaling your way through, right? So that is, in a nutshell, kind of how I would overcome that particular thing.
That was outstanding. Thank you.
The only additional extra thing I'd say is, optimize the environment as much as possible. So studies show that, I'm not going to go into the detail, but studies basically show that environment is more important to influence your behavior than is having a plan, having motivation, or having intention. So if the environment sets you up in a way, I call this the cookie jar effect. When you've got a cookie jar on your kitchen table, you might have a cookie every day. Without that cookie jar, you may never go to buy cookies independently. So the environment will dictate our behavior. So control the environment first, and willpower should be the last possible resort. When you're using willpower, you screwed up somewhere. Right? Your environment should be a ramp that takes you from high potential gravitational energy rolling down that hill of productivity through to, wherever you need to go, right? Just a natural flow of events that occurs by default, because it's just simply the easiest and laziest thing for you to do. And oh, look, it happens to be also the most productive. I say in my office where my PS4 is literally right next to me. So yeah, and there was a lot of people that have what's called willpower exhaustion. I'm sure you can think of people that are like this. They rely on only willpower, nothing else. And the willpower is just everything. And then over time, that's just not sustainable. You just burn out and you don't really get anywhere productive that way. And it's also incredibly tiring to live that way. I went through just purely willpower through my first year of university, and it sucked. It just sucked a lot. So I would never really want to do that. Like I mentioned before that I think I don't have any willpower really left anymore because I used all of it for like the rest of my life. I'm sick of willpower. I can't summon any. So I just don't use it. And I scroll through Instagram and I read what people say about, this topic, because I follow those like tags and stuff and comment on people's posts. And they're always talking about, I'm so not motivated and whatever. And it's like, that's the problem. You need motivation. They're thinking about how to push the boulder up the hill. I'm thinking, how do I just roll it down a hill so I don't have to push in the first place? There was this quick question on YouTube that said, do you endorse the Mind Palace technique and the PEG system? Yes. So, okay, the person's username here is Devil May Cry. So I don't know who this is. I've got Devil May Cry on my desk right next to me, actually. But the PEG system, I don't know which PEG system they're talking about. Because there's a PEG system that I've created, which is a time management technique and studying technique. I just, for some reason, don't feel like they're talking about that one. Mind Palace technique, yes, I actually have a video on that technique where I talk about how to use it. So just have a look at that on my YouTube. It's around how to memorize a lot more really quickly. There's a right way and a wrong way to use it though, just as an FYI. But I'm gonna try to keep this one not super study related. Cool. Any other questions you had, or any questions that you had about any of the tactics or strategies that I talked about?
Yeah,
No?
I have a
Oh yeah, no, you go.
sorry, you go. Oh, thanks. I have this question for uni students because I'm one. We have a lot to study. So me, including some of my friends, we schedule what we need to study every single day from like 6 a.m. to 9:40 p.m. That's my schedule. And then, do you recommend us doing that? Because we schedule every single minute, such as 8:30 to 9:40, I need to study this, and then 11:20 to 12, I eat lunch, and then right after lunch, I study something else.
So a bit of a nuanced question because there's not going to be a yes or no. First of all, does it work for you? If it works, don't mess around with it. Do you want more? If the answer is yes, then you can't use that anymore. So the attention management thing only becomes really important when you need to get more, when you need more. So for example, if your time management is based around a very robust schedule, there isn't something inherently wrong with that. Okay? If it works and you're able to keep it consistent. If it's not working, or you're wanting to do more and you're not able to fit it in, that's where it becomes potentially you need to start using more attention management instead of time management. That's where the issue is. But if you're pretty happy with the way that things are balanced and you're scheduling it okay, then it's fine. Right? So for me, I used that sort of system for a very long time, years. And I only really started moving into attention management when I started doing a lot more on top of what I was normally doing, right? Like I was dancing, going to the gym, having a social life, setting up my business, tutoring, studying, simultaneously trying to balance all of that. That's where I found that time management was just not flexible enough for me. But, you right now are in a very specific situation, right? Where you are in a very academic year of your life where you are kind of putting aside a lot of other things for study. And so that priority is really set there. So you can potentially afford to just go with the time management. But if anyone's watching and they don't feel that the time management is really cutting it for them, I would say don't keep just trying the same time management strategy that hasn't been working forever. Try the attention management strategy instead, which does take a little bit longer to get used to. Feels a bit confusing and chaotic at times, but overall can potentially be more effective.
Thanks.
I've got a question here from first name, last name. How do you find the motivation to make notes on top of doing homework? How do you create that sense of urgency that you should be making notes well before your exams? I never feel an urgency to make notes. And actually, if you watch enough of my videos, you will know that my view on notes is very not what you think, probably not the view you have, but also my view is the right view to have. So I would really consider watching some of the videos I have on like how to write notes, and the previous live study with me that I did before where, the notes are such a tiny part of my learning that I almost consider it nearly optional. And that's super important because if you start building a dependency on when to write notes and how to write the notes and all of that sort of thing, it's taking the focus away from where the learning actually is meant to be. And the learning is meant to be inside your head and it's meant to be built organically. And if the focus is on the notes, then you're never really going to calibrate that sense of real learning. And a lot of the more advanced techniques, especially later in life when you're transitioning into that working space, you're going to really struggle to learn effectively. And these are things that you can start applying from high school. So don't make notes if you don't feel the need to. If you feel the need to make notes, why? Where does that need come from? Does it come from a sense of insecurity? Where is it from? And then have a look at my videos on that. So there's a pretty long answer about that. And I really recommend watching my videos on it. Did you guys have another question?
It wasn't a question. It was just me saying that I really related to your like thing where you leave everything to like not the last minute where you know you have to do it or you're just not going to get it done. Like for instance today where I've left my English writing portfolio till the night before.
Yeah.
Probably not the smartest thing to do, but I feel like it's
But it has to be a conscious decision.
Yeah, I feel like it's the best way I work, and I figured this out over NCA. Like, I started off writing them like weeks before, and I'd be like going for 3 weeks, and then on the third week, I'd hate everything I'd done because it'd just been me trying to write things. And then the night before, I'd write everything, and it was actually decent.
Yeah. As long as you're not like stressing every moment before, and that's the thing. Like when you know it's a conscious decision, you're like, okay, I know I've got 2 weeks to work on this, but I am gonna work on it, the night before. So until that, I'm not gonna think about it. I'm gonna be fine. So if it's a conscious decision, that's more empowering. But it has to be well thought through. Don't just leave everything to the last minute just because, evaluate how long it really would take down to the wire and then schedule that in and you can make that fit. That works. But if it's not well thought through, that's just suicide. Right. So, and actually, additional point is that when you sort of leave things to the last minute as such, in a way, the last minute is a very kind of subjective mark that you put. So let's say, for example, you don't really care whether you fail an assessment. Well, there isn't really a last minute anymore, right? Like that idea of a last minute kind of depends on where your priority is. So for me, I really don't prioritize doing homework. I really prioritize a lot of other things in my life. And I mean, I enjoy learning. I love learning. And this is why I'm in this space, right? And I like studying when there's a purpose that I can relate to and I feel that's relevant and interesting. But I don't like studying just for the sake of studying. I'm not buying out, legal textbooks just to, do something. And because of that, I set my own deadline on when I want that urgency. So, for example, if I need to study something and I've got, let's say, 3 months to study it, to be totally honest, I'd rather just finish studying it in 2 weeks and then spend the rest of the time doing something else and just revising it once a week after that than constantly just dragging it out. So for me, I just bring the deadline forward. And instead, I'll schedule in a crap load of stuff in between there. So it's like, okay, I'm going to finish this in 3 weeks so that after that I can go on like a trip here and then I'll do this and I'll start on this and I'll do another project and whatever. Like I'm recently deciding to learn how to do some software development. So I'm just learning a few software languages. And it's like, okay, it should take me around like 9 months to do it. Why don't I just try to do it in like 3 months? And then I can, and then schedule other things in around it. So it creates that sense of urgency because I've got so much to lose now. My students that I privately coach on how to study more effectively, I don't know if I know that one of my students was actually tuned in a few of my students tuned in before. I had a session with him earlier today actually, and I told him to just finish that, he can probably just finish studying not only year 12, but year 13 stuff within the next, month or two. And it's like, that's actually totally doable if you're good at studying. It's really easy. Like, it's really easy for him to study 3 weeks of high school material in like 1 day. It's very doable. So it's like, okay, why don't you go finish the rest of high school in the next couple months, and then you can spend the rest of high school doing literally anything else that you want. To spend once a week to revise so you don't forget, do 5 scholarships, get all of them, get top marks for all of your exams anyway. It's like there's so much potential there when you think about it in this way. We're probably going to just one more question. We'll just do one more question, and if you guys think of any questions, think of them now, and we'll do those, and I'll just wrap it up. How do you revise for exams, and how would you schedule it from the time you start until the exams? So revising for exams, you want to make sure that you have pretty much just a spaced repetition algorithm sort of in place. So from the point of doing the lecture, make sure that you're studying it on the day of the lecture, make sure you're doing it a couple days afterwards, and then you're doing it at the end of the week, and then do it every week after that for at least a month or so, and then you can schedule it on a monthly basis up until the exams. Depends how much you need to cover in the exams. I've got a video on what to do when you're behind. If you feel like you're behind, watch that. Use that strategy because it's very specific. And as long as your revisions are challenging and it's different and it's using full only recall and not, reading things again and again and rewriting things, just follow those principles. And that should give you an overall good guideline. It's hard for me to tell you, Nicole, on what the exact schedule should be because I don't know your situation, where your level is, what you need to work on, what barriers you're going to find, how deep your learning is right now, your own time limitations. I don't have that information, so I can't give you that. But it's whatever I would create for you, it would be created based on those principles. Spaced repetition, challenging, different and varied every single time, always looking for weaknesses, and just making sure that I'm relying on as much recall as possible. And when I say recall, I actually recommend don't even look at your notes within 24 hours of your revision time, because you might be able to look briefly at a mind map and that might be just enough to trigger a series of thoughts. But if you hadn't seen that mind map, you might not have been able to summon that from the very beginning. So even a very brief recognition trigger for 0.5 second might be enough to help you, and you wouldn't have that really. So when I say do full recall, I mean block out the whole day or even week before to not even touch that material and not even look at it. So you have full recall. And even try to revise at a higher level of mastery. So don't just try to recall, which is seeing if you can if you still understand and can explain concepts, apply it at a higher level, or try to recall the relationship between multiple concepts simultaneously, or try to prioritize, create new mind maps, create new problem and challenging questions for yourself. Refer to Bloom's taxonomy, look at the pyramid, aim to challenge yourself at the highest levels of that pyramid, not in the lower levels of the pyramid. So ask yourself, when I revise, which levels of this mastery of knowledge am I actually testing myself on? If it's the lower levels, that's a waste of time. You should have covered that way early on. This can be quite a deep topic, so I can't really go into it in full depth right now, but I've got some other videos on that. And I'm sure I'll have another study clinic about this in the future as well. Any final questions?
Don't think so. That was awesome.
I think I got one last one. So I think for many uni students in high school, of course, we gradually become the Nick Fury type of students that you mentioned before. Was the revising strategy you mentioned
that's designed to
with fix?
Yeah.
That
exactly correct. Yeah. So for anyone that didn't pick up on that, Nick Fury syndrome is a thing that I call it. Hey, if you see Nick Fury syndrome being used anywhere else, that's stolen straight from me. All right, you tell me about it. So Nick Fury syndrome is what I call it when you have a student who is high functioning, usually well prepared, well organized. The stuff they study, they know it really well, and they enter it into exam very confidently, but the results they get are usually not as good as they expect it to be, and that's because they've got a blind spot, and they always consistently do not see that blind spot. And the idea with this revision, and that's almost always because the revision strategy is broken. Not universally, but almost always. And so when I say look for weaknesses, this is what I mean is actively challenge yourself to find what you don't know. And it's really difficult to find what you don't know, which is why you need to do things like challenging questions, creating mind map, full recall, tangential thinking, quizzing each other, not just using past paper questions, but making your own questions, things like that really push the top levels of Bloom's taxonomy, because it's really hard to create a heavily interconnected, multi-concept, high-level question testing on the fringe of not only just out of scope, but so out of scope that it's, way distant. It's really hard to create and answer a question like that when you've got a deficiency somewhere. And that is a way that you highlight those gaps. Things like teaching someone else, slowing down, being really clear and explicit. So these are the things that prevent Nick Fury syndrome. These revision strategies, some of the most efficient ones, can be quite time consuming, which is why it's even more important for people that are at risk of this Nick Fury syndrome, because they're usually students that are prepared enough that they have the time to do that. So Nicole just asked, so if you can't remember that content, then would you reread the lecture and retest again? I wouldn't just reread the lecture. I would go and dive into it to a lot of depth. Don't aim for the depth of understanding the lecture. Aim for being able to use that information to create an entirely new hypothesis. Go out of scope. Read the research that's being published on that topic. Read those damn Wikipedia articles that are like so freaking long, and learn about the history of the background of the guy who discovered it. Just go super, super in depth if there's something that you've missed, because it's a high risk area of missing it again, and just see how can I connect it to everything I've already learned? How can I simplify that information? Always how can I simplify it, and how can I build a model out of this that tells me how the information connects together, not just what it is that I need to know. If you make your own question, how are you supposed to know the answer to it? Well, I mean, think of a hobby that you know really well. And I want you to create a quiz question about that hobby. You think you can answer it? Probably you can, because you know the information. One of the worst things that I hear from high school students all the time, and uni students, is like, such an obsession about like having answers. It's not about having the answer. It's about asking and answering the question. That's where the learning is. In fact, looking at the answers actually detriments the learning in a lot of ways. If you're relying on having the answer there, that there's a fundamental shift in learning that just has to occur, which is that learning is not a process where you have an outcome that you ingest. Learning is a process of confusion where you constantly go back and forth between possibilities and find the trends and variables between them. It's a process of synthesis. You're creating knowledge. So if you didn't create the answer, you didn't learn. You just consumed it. And just because you consumed it, it's not an apple where the atoms are just digested and become part of your fingernails. If you didn't create it and you just consumed it, you're just going to shit it out again. And it's not going to be on your exam paper. So I often say that you should create questions. Very rarely do I say that the first approach should be using past paper questions. Pretty much the only two ways that I think past paper questions are relevant is number one, and by far the most important number one, is to just give a slightly stylistic different way of applying your knowledge. It's like when you've got a key, it's already cut, it's made, good metal, good design, you've tested it, and you're putting in, and you're just shimmying it in the lock. You're just shimmying it. That's what practice papers mean for me. Just shimmying it in the lock. It's not making the key, it's not figuring out the cut, it's nothing like that. It's a functioning key and you're just shimmying it. That's all it is. The second is to get an idea of how they might test you. But the thing is, they can always change that. And they're not at no obligation to tell you about that. So if you prepared around how they might test you, you're screwed. Not always. You might not always be screwed, but you'll always be a near miss. And the thing is, if you've got an air traffic controller and they're doing a process that produces a near miss, and 99 out of 100 times they get lucky and it ends up being exactly as it should have been, and they get a good outcome, would you say that the air traffic controller did a good job? Probably not. They're just really, really lucky. So if you use that process for preparing constantly, and you're going to have how many, 100 exams, throughout your life, you're going to hit that at some point. And that's what happened to, a whole generation of uni students 3 years ago. So, chemistry used to repeat the past paper questions that they used for the exams every single year to the point where you could almost predict the questions. And then they just, boom, changed it. And then everyone was just shocked. But, that's just how it is. Cool. I think that's about enough to wrap it up. You guys reckon?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. Well, thanks for joining in. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for being my guest. Thanks for everyone that was watching. If you have any further questions, leave them in the comments. And if you have any ideas for any further streams, clinics that we'll be running, usually I do these clinics something along the lines of once every 3 to 4 weeks. So if you have another set of questions, let me know, flick me a message, leave them as a comment, and we'll schedule in for next time. If you want to be a guest, just let me know as well, and I'll rope you in and bring you in for the next one as well. And yeah, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Sweet.
Thanks,
Thank
Justin.
you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
See you, everyone.
All right.